Deputy Speaker, my grievance is to the Minister for Commerce and Industrial Relations. Minister, as a lawyer practising in asbestos litigation and workers' compensation, I'm keenly aware of the significant cost to our community that occupational lung cancers carry. That's why I'm deeply troubled by the recent spate of silicosis cases in Queensland. Minister, silicosis is a lung disease resulting from the inhalation of silica dust, which can take acute, accelerated and chronic forms, either simple or complicated in nature. Its symptoms, as you might expect, include coughing, breathlessness and tiredness. It can progress long after exposure at work. In June 2017, the New South Wales Parliament Standing Committee on Law and Justice conducted the first review of the dust diseases and lifetime care and support schemes. In proceedings, that committee heard evidence from Dr Susan Miles. Now, Dr Miles is a respiratory and sleep physician and a New South Wales Occupational and Environmental Lung Disease Special Interest Group member, and also a member of the Thoracic Society of Australia and New Zealand. Her evidence was to this effect. Recently, there have been several cases of silicosis diagnosed in New South Wales from the engineered stone products industry, that is, the manufacture of Caesar stone, which have arisen despite existing legislation. One of these patients is currently awaiting a lung transplant. Her colleague, Dr Miles' colleague Dr. Anthony Johnston, whose credentials match those of Dr Miles in all relevant aspects, added that it is a huge problem. I'm aware of 5 or 6 cases in the last 12 months in New South Wales. Dr Miles has also conveniently written an article for the newspaper The Conversation about silicosis. In that article, she says this: silicosis was more common in Australia in the 1940s to 1960s, particularly in construction and demolition workers. Growing awareness of the disease and the importance of reducing exposure to dust, for instance, wearing masks at work, wetting the dust or other safe work practices, has reduced the number of cases. Referring back to the New South Wales review, Dr Miles says, with heavy exposure you can get acute silicosis, which is a proteinaceous process which can be lethal acutely. That is with a very heavy exposure. Otherwise, it's generally a slower progression, maybe over 5 to 10 years. You get calcium deposits and the lymph nodes get calcified, but it's not such a quick process. A 2016 scholarly article in the Annals of Occupational Hygiene suggested that approximately 6.6% of Australian workers are exposed to crystalline silica dust and 3.7% are heavily exposed. Now, as I said, that committee review was conducted in June last year. Dr Miles' Conversation article that I've referred to was published in August last year. Fast forward 1 year and Luke Pirelli, who's a legal practitioner at Shine, writes for the Australian Lawyers Alliance that, quote, an unwelcome epidemic is re-emerging to haunt Australia's stonemasons. And I'm quoting from that article: at a time when dangerous work practices should be on the decline, it's alarming to see such a spike in silicosis cases. Employers in this industry should know the dangers of engineered stone, and they have an obligation to implement practices and procedures to ensure that employees are not at risk of developing life-threatening conditions like silicosis. Then, lo and behold, it turns out that 22 silicosis claims, including 6 cases of terminal silicosis, were lodged with Queensland's work cover over a 3-week period in September, prompting that state government to warn workers to get tested. By comparison, there had been just 6 workers' compensation claims in Queensland for silicosis in the 22 years from 1982 to 2004. The New South Wales Review also heard evidence from Theodora Alias, the National Practice Head of Asbestos and Dust Diseases Department at Morris Blackburn Lawyers, who told the committee of cases such as Mr K. Now, Mr K worked as a jackhammer operator for 20 years. He had silicosis, so he was able to invoke the jurisdiction of the Dust Diseases Authority, but had nil disability flowing from his silicosis. So whilst it was determined that he had a dust disease within the ambit of authority, he had no disability flowing from it, right? Which meant that he was not able to access a dust diseases compensation pension. Now, Ms Alias in her evidence described the protracted and expensive judicial process required to achieve justice for workers such as Mr K and their families. Now, Minister, as distinct from a substance such as asbestos, for which there is no safe level of exposure, my understanding is that the risks of exposure to silica dust can in fact be managed. And Minister, you'll be aware, I'm sure, of the terrific work of the Cancer Council and the work that they've done in raising awareness of the issue of exposure to silica dust and the consequences for that for employees. And I'm just quoting from their Occupational Cancer Risk Series Silica Dust Information Sheet, where they say this, and this is a sentiment that I agree with: workers need to, quote, eliminate or reduce exposure to hazards by following the risk management process and using the hierarchy of control. Workers should always be involved in the process to correctly identify hazards and control measures that suit the workplace and task. If suitable control measures are not in place, anyone working around silica dust has an increased risk of developing lung cancer. So can I just notify that, bring that to your attention, and just commend the Cancer Council for the excellent work they've done in raising awareness of this issue. They say that when it comes to air monitoring, the mandatory limit for silica dust exposure in Australia is 0.1 milligrams per million, averaged over an 8-hour day. Now, Minister, it seems that in addition to the terrific work that the Cancer Council have done to raise awareness of this issue, perhaps this is something that the Commissioner for Occupational Health and Safety might seek to issue guidance notes to employers and employees about, so that they can mitigate and manage the risk of silica exposure, which causes silicosis. Given what has transpired, given that in the 40s, 50s and 60s we had a greater prevalence of this disease and that tapered off over time and it's only now returning, my view would be that this is a time for vigilance and not for complacency. And I think that the events that have transpired in Queensland put that into sharp focus. So, Minister, my grievance to you is in two parts. What can we do to encourage employers and employees to make sure they take the necessary steps to prevent exposure to dangerous levels of silica dust? And are we satisfied that the Workers' Compensation and Injury Management Act, which contains particular provisions for exposure to silicosis, is fit for purpose in terms of dealing with these issues and these cases as they arise, so that the bureaucratic nightmare that plaintiffs such as Mr Kay have experienced in New South Wales won't be repeated in Western Australia?
Minister.
Thank you very much, and I thank the member for this grievance, and I want to once again note his extensive experience prior to entering Parliament in representing workers who suffered injuries at work, and particularly around these long-acting workplace diseases like silicosis and asbestosis, mesothelioma. The member for Mount Lawley is well regarded in the workers' compensation and health and safety area because of his depth of understanding and contribution to protecting workers from harm. Now, I share, Member, your desire to reduce risks from harm. It's not clear why there's been this spike in claims in Queensland. And we're fortunate that here in Western Australia we don't have that replicated. In fact, I can assure you that, in fact, since 1980, we haven't had a single claim for silicosis in the mining industry, with over 112,000 workers in the mining industry in Western Australia. We don't have any claims for silicosis, which is extraordinary. Of course, these new manufactured stone benchtops are a new challenge. It's not clear so far that whether these Queensland claims arise out of the manufacturing of manufactured stone benchtops or if it's about the installation of them. Now, obviously, manufacturing, whilst the impact on the worker is no less dramatic or effective, but obviously there are limited workplaces in respect of manufacturing, and therefore it's a smaller challenge to have regulatory action in that regard compared to the question of installation. And I'm sure there's many people even in this chamber have had kitchen refurbishments, and many people now prefer the manufactured stone benchtops because they have a price advantage over the natural stones. However, there is this real question about the potential higher silica content in the manufactured product rather than the natural product. So I can assure you that actually in the current financial year, the Department of Mines, Industry Regulation and Safety through WorkSafe WA is targeting silica dust issues. I can assure you that the regulations in Western Australia clearly deal with exposure to silica dust, and there's a whole range of regulations requiring companies to have a material safety data sheet, and I'm sure you're aware of what that does. It provides details of all the materials chemicals and materials that make up any particular item that's being used. They require employers to have assessed risk and harm and have deal with exposure, plans to deal with exposure to the crystalline silica in workplaces, ensure that no person is exposed to workplace crystalline silica dust in excess of the exposure standards that you mentioned in your speech, in your presentation. As far as practicable, to reduce risks to persons arising from the exposure, ensure that each person who is likely to be exposed at the workplace receives, before commencing work, relevant and adequate information and training, and ensure that appropriate monitoring is done and a record kept to the results of monitoring of each person who is likely to be exposed, and each of the, if failure to comply with those regulations are offences under the Act and therefore could lead to penalties. So we do have a robust regulatory regime, and I'm also pleased to say that this year the department has had a special project to focus on exposure to silica dust, particularly in the kitchen refurbishment industry. And I'll let you know that WorkSafe's website contains safety alerts and information bulletins as part of that campaign to raise awareness about the impacts of silica dust. Now, I have the very active Queensland Minister, Grace has, of course, written to me about the problems that have occurred in Queensland, and she's very keen to make sure that there's action at the national level, and so she has sought Safe Work Australia, review the exposure levels, and we support the Honourable Grace's efforts on behalf of the Queensland Government in that regard. So we're very keen to see Safe Work Australia in its proper role of coordinating health and safety practices across the nation, look back at these exposure levels, and if there's, because of new scientific understandings, if we have to lower those exposure limits, we would be very, very keen to see that occur. Now, in respect of workers' compensation, already the deeming provisions for pneumonia, I can't say the proper word, from work-related pneumonia diseases would apply. There we go. Yeah. Excellent. They do indeed. And so they would apply to silicosis. However, I'm sure you'd be pleased to know that the new Act that is currently being drafted, which arises from the 2014 report that was the statutory review of the Act that was completed under the term of the last government and then sat on the minister's desk until the change of government, there will be new arrangements to allow for the scheduling of diseases in the new arrangements, so that those proclaimed diseases would automatically be captured by the deeming provisions, which obviously would make people impacted by these diseases more favourably treated by the system. So you can see we're acting right across the regulatory framework to work against this scourge of silicosis. Thank you very much.